Welcome to the Retro 21 Studios podcast. I'm your host, M Squared. Please support the podcast by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons on our various podcast channels, such as Podbean, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And so I'm like, that's from 2018, 2019. What's happening today? The Harvard Business Review article was from 2023. And it said, unfortunately, we haven't fixed this yet.
No. And in fact, it's getting worse. So I would say lots of businesses are saying, where is ours? We need ours. We need to be competitive. We need to stay at the front of the landscape. We have academics that are looking at the explosion from business saying, whoa, we've been working in this area for 20 years and have never seen any of these algorithms to test and know what's useful and what's not, because there's a whole host of them that are proprietary. There's not good ways. They're still missing some good ways, let me just say, to evaluate AI. One great way, it would be with synthetic data. I think synthetic data is going to be part of the future in all of this. Why? Because data is what we use to educate AI, right? Humans are the trainers. We have human processes and human data that we feed to the machines to learn how to do it like we do it. So then they turn around and do what we do, and they can do more and more quickly, right? But what we're also showcasing in biased AI is biased human processes. But we had a human along the way that said, you know what? I've not extended any home loans in the past 6 weeks to a black couple that's come through. I better get one in before somebody pings me on something. Right? I don't mean that to sound disparaging. We have case studies and news reports that things like that have happened. So,
you're gaming the system. You haven't fixed the AI, but you see the anomaly and you just fix it manually, basically.
Well, you can, but I also feel like the future also should hold AI checking AI. So then like AI is training on certain data, but then we have other AI algorithms that are looking at the data for bias assessment and making those corrections to say, in a perfect world, in an equitable world, the data would look like this. And then that synthetic data can be cross-referenced into the AI's algorithm development. You see where I'm going with this? So if I develop something that says, how do I prioritize people? I can prioritize people based off the training data and how we have prioritized people in the past. But then we can have another algorithm over to the side to say, has the way we've prioritized people in the past been fair? And if it's not, what would fairness look like? Now we're going to make fair data. Now, what does the algorithm for risk say with the fair data run through it? This is a great framework that builds off of all the data that we already have in all of these systems. There's a ton of data already floating around. People are trying to get a handle on all of that. And synthetic data would give us a great way to naturally experiment with what we think the world should look like, what we want the data to eventually look like. And then the AI can help us get there by saying, these are the gaps and here's the stuff. And in some cases, they may come back and say, it wouldn't matter. In a fair world, this algorithm would still do these things. The hope is that once we get really good at this, then we can experiment with AI without having to fully open up the black box, right? An evaluation specialist can say, this is the current data. This is the data that should look like if it was a perfectly equitable world. But then you could also go the other way and say, what happens if my data was even more racist? How bad can this problem be? And then and in statistics, we have something that we call sensitivity analyses, where you play about a lot of these different dimensions and see how it goes. A lot of times what we look for is, does the answer change depending on these inputs? And so there needs to be a whole slew of new sensitivity style analyses for AI where we can put in these what ifs. But now what you need is a what if generator. And a what if generator is a different problem than solving these AI algorithm bias issues. Now, a lot of people are working around this because there's a lot of data floating around, right? We're just trying to get it all together. So we're trying to create better registries. We're trying to harmonize data from other places. We're trying to have large data sources so that people have good training repositories so that they can work through some of this. They want to move out of this like garbage in, garbage out philosophy, but garbage in may be all you have at times, right? So if garbage in's all you've got, but you've got something where people are hurting and there's a need for automation and we need to go faster and we need to be able to do more, then we have to work with what we've got. But in working with what we got, we don't have to just settle with that. We can take what we have, we can permute it, we can move it around, we can play with it, we can add noise to it, we can do a whole bunch of other things with it. And I think that's going to be part of the future in terms of stuff.
So, Jason, you described multiple calls to action. And when going through these various use cases, I'm just thinking in terms of mission critical systems. You talk about the future. Some of these systems are today. And if you were to prioritize from a mission criticality perspective, where would that be and what can be done in the interim before we get to this wonderful state?
Love it. This is a terrific question. And thank you for asking it. There is a data set within the NIH, a large National Institute of Health project called All of Us. All of Us is a pretty novel effort to have a registry of data of individuals who are traditionally left out of other studies. It is focused on minority race populations, LGBTQIA populations, other populations rural populations, other populations that don't normally get well represented in other data sources. And they have been working to get a large comprehensive data set on stuff like this. We need more efforts like that. Now, All of Us is not getting handwriting samples and resumes and backgrounds. It's getting health stuff. It's getting your electronic health records and your history. It does you a few family background surveys and all of this other stuff. It's a wealth of information, but it's all medical information on stuff. That doesn't give us good alternate sources for how people from other communities write to each other. When we pull social media data down, right, it's heavily centered towards majority populations. And that's where a lot of our AI has been trained on, like chatbot interactions, phrasing of things. And quite often we find that chatbots and other large language models are not as culturally competent naturally. We have to put in those rules and say, no, we're not talking about this when you have these questions. And when people ask about these topics, we're not talking about it that way. Or we code in and say, if you're going to have this topic, the large language model has to preface by saying, I may not have all the right information on this, or I may not be the best source on those things. And I think that there's a huge move in the industry right now to have some of that. And I think that once we have more information on how marginalized communities operate, how they work together, how they talk together. And quite often they're more closed off. We've had some projects and some discussions with indigenous and native communities on stuff. So they live in a very different world in many cases than a lot of other Americans. Not just their physical resources and what they have access to, but their culture, their language, their dialogue, all of those things. And then again, from that historical perspective, if a business did not find that those populations were a good part of their market share, why would you even focus on them? Why would you build an AI for people that aren't in the base of people that you're doing business with? You probably wouldn't.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was actually, I'm not sure if it was the same Harvard article. It was on that very topic, and it brought up the trust factor. Okay, in order to help enhance these models, we need penetration into some of the historically disadvantaged communities. But at the same time, the catch-22 is that the trust factor is low, and so they're closed off. And so ways in which you could somewhat naturally harvest that data is just not penetrating. It's not getting through.
That's right. And let me add to that one other thing. Jason, where's your controversial moment for the podcast? Where do you not align with the rest of the industry on things? It's my opinion, my personal opinion, not my company's opinion, not the American Statistical Association's opinion, even though I've mentioned this to people at ASA. It's my personal opinion that the math for some of this is still biased. Like, how do you have biased math? We developed a set of statistical algorithms and procedures in the early 20th century to deal with data. We do hypothesis testing and p-values and confidence intervals and all of that stuff. We develop all of that to get through what we call sampling variation. So you don't have the entire population. You haven't done a census. You've got a sample, and you wonder whether or not that sample adequately reflects the population of interest. Mm-hmm. All of that math is designed for what we call a large sample. We get a large sample of individuals, and once you have a large enough sample, then all of the math will work the way we want it to. The problem with that is at the foundation level, populations are of different sizes. Mm-hmm. So if I say I need 1,000 white individuals and 1,000 indigenous individuals to do a particular study, it is easier to get 1,000 white people out of a country that is 60 to 70% white, and there are 150 to 200 million white people in the United States, versus indigenous populations that are less than 10% of this country. It's the size of the population, and then us saying we have to have the same amount of data to be equitable in training. What that does is it creates an additional barrier for those communities to overcome. They have to now overcome just a basic math hurdle in the way we've designed the math to get to the right confidence intervals and the p-values. You might say, oh, I have to go to 1,000 whites and 1,000 non-whites. Mm-hmm. But it's easier to get a sample of 1,000 whites because the population is so much larger. And we don't have incorporated well within the math the discussion about the fact that the population of whites versus the population of indigenous folks in the United States is 8, 10, 12, 15 to 1. It's not the samples, it's the populations that are different. So then when we take samples for statistical analysis or training data or machine learning or artificial or any of those use cases, when we set a target number that we have to have for these algorithms to understand what's going on, once you set that number, you have created for minority communities an additional barrier that they have to overcome. And that is not written into the math, and it is not written into the system. And it does contribute to some of the biases that we have to do, because it means that those communities have to work harder to provide the same evidence to have a fair algorithm to do what we need to do. And we don't think about it from that perspective.
That's interesting. So, Jason, how would you normalize that data? Is just a matter of weighting, some sort of weighting exercise, or what do you do?
So that then becomes the question. And I have a feeling that we're just not there yet. We have not figured this out. I think it's case by case, but there's no textbook on this. There are some great textbooks that are coming out in health disparities analytics, but I would love like an equity analytics book that just covers end to end on things. It's not out there. Nobody's written it. Why has nobody written it? Because the professors didn't help develop these algorithms. Industry developed these algorithms, and they don't need a textbook for it, because a textbook would violate proprietariness of some of this, right? So that gets in the way of all of it. But how do we fix it? I think what we haven't done in the data sciences is listen to our folks that do qualitative experience from the perspective that they tell you that equity is all about intersectionality. When we talk about maternal health outcomes in the United States, it is not, we know that we don't have the same outcomes as other Western developed countries, other first world countries on this, but they will tell you that people that study this will tell you that it really is about the intersectionality. Like, where are the worst outcomes? Black females in the U.S. South have it worse than other groups. So from that perspective, like, that impacts training data, that impacts all the other aspects of stuff that we're doing in all of it. And we don't really hone in on intersectionality as a fundamental aspect of AI evaluation. Now, it's in there for training, right? The language models, network models, tree models, all those things, they do intersectionality to begin with much better than regression models in terms of stuff. But like all of the advanced language models, all the deep learning models, they start with an intersection perspective. And it's that intersectionality that contributes to this idea of a black box. I don't know what it's doing, for whom, where, and when, but it seems to work. And in some cases, it's putting marginalized populations on a small island and saying, I don't really know what to do with these folks, but I don't really need to, because I can bypass all my other performance calculations by not worrying about the people on this island.
So what happens to those people? What are things that they could do? It's a bit of a rhetorical question. What can they do to help identify these sorts of biases, and how do they get out of that?
I think that it's going to be community-based. I think that groups of individuals who feel as though they're not getting a fair shake will have to have an advocacy group, just like everywhere else. And those advocacy groups have to be armed with data as well to show the results. When we say the AI is a black box, it's not known, but is knowable, how do we know? We know from the inputs, the training data, and if it's biased, and the synthetic data is probably part of the answer on the input end. But then we have the output end. And community organizations can monitor things like home loans. They can monitor government services. They can monitor business services and availability and those things. And they do that. And then I think we need a better marrying of that data to say the reason why this is happening is because you've automated decision making that has inversely impacted this community.
Makes me think of the Compass system when that was implemented to help judges with their sentencing decisions. It was coming out that, wow, black individuals are getting harsher, longer sentences, which happened to be the case before the system was implemented. It's okay, what did we buy?
People were biased. We created a system that mimicked people on a large scale, and then we're surprised that it's biased.
Exactly. Hey, flipping back really quick to the testing standards. And I was looking at your LinkedIn, and you referenced a paper from, I believe it was out of Berkeley, and it talked about some sort of standards consistent with NIST. Can you talk about that?
Oh, yes. I love this. So there is a framework for fair AI development and evaluation. It is done by the National Institute for Standards and Technology. You can go to their website and find it. That's NIST. And it's right on the front of the webpage. It is a document. I think it was released somewhere at time either last year or in the past 18 months. It's fairly recent. But it's a wonderful document for technical specialists, people that have been in this area for a while, but new people. Like, this is a document that I'd want new people to break into. If you're listening and you're taking a data science boot camp, or you're trying to learn Python, R, machine learning, and all that stuff on your own, you would do well to open this document and take a look at it. And maybe we can post the link in the show notes later or something.
Absolutely.
I've seen a couple of presentations on it. It has a very good framework all the way around. But my only real criticism of it is that, again, it was developed by government folks for mostly business applications. And so we still have a huge contingent of academics and great thinkers that have not fully been able to weigh in, or they haven't weighed in an organized way. Now, that NIST document has brought some of that in and incorporated, and I think it's probably the best thing that's on the market right now if you're really dedicated. There's also some documentation from IBM on trustworthy AI, and there is a fairness toolkit out there, Fairness 360 toolkit, I think is what it's called. And then I did a paper for SAS Global Forum. You can search under my name in SAS Global Forum that has a state of the art in terms of where we're at on algorithm assessment. And so there's a few links in there on some additional materials, and you can get a sense of which academics are working with this and what they're doing. And so you can go down a few rabbit holes in some of those places.
Got it. All right. This is cool. But right now, there's no mandate, right? So you can go out to NIST, you could get the standards, feel like you're in the ballpark. But from a mandate perspective, so I worked with smart meters. And so to put a meter to market, you have to go through NIST in Canada. It's Measurement Canada. And you have to go through all these checklists. So in the case of AI, when we're dealing with mission critical systems, then you're saying that there's no mandate in that realm right now as it stands?
Yeah, I would say that there is no mandate. But I also have seen news articles and seen things from Congress where they are interviewing those folks, and the industry's asking for it. I think in general, regulation is considered bad for business, right?
Right. Yep.
And there already are bad actors out there that are using AI that they know to be biased. And they've had a data scientist behind them saying, if we fix this, we're going to lose this amount of money, but we should fix it. And then they said, we're not going to fix it right now. Let's see if we can find an alternate solution. Because, again, fixes can be costly. They can impact how an organization's doing things. And if you put in an AI in place 5 years ago and it's making you a lot of money, you're reluctant to change from that without really staunch evidence and somebody else saying, okay, it's time to make a change here. So I think the changes are coming. I'm hoping that something devastating doesn't happen at first to precipitate such a change. But I think that a lot of folks are looking at that. It's just what to regulate, what to put in, and how. Because again, if we haven't figured out all the math, how can we impose regulation? Because there's no benchmark, there's no comparison, there's no standard. All of that stuff needs to be in place in order to have proper regulation that doesn't just pick and choose between certain groups. And the way you would regulate an AI that's doing risk scoring for cancer or cardiovascular disease or something like that versus how you measure whether or not a language model's giving out racist content or lying to you, those are different, way different problems. They might have some similarities in the foundational mathematics, but the applications are so different that we're going to need standards for each of these areas. And how far down the rabbit hole do you go on that? We're back to when we had the first explosion of the web, right? I was much younger than I am now, and I wasn't even in college yet, but I was part of that generation. The internet was coming of age, and there was a lot of discussion about internet regulation. How do we regulate that? Do we regulate .coms the same way we regulate .edus? There was a lot of discussion early on about whether or not adult content should be given the .x thing. Imagine where we would be at in 2023 if all adult-themed content had to have the .x piece. Right. We didn't make those decisions back then, and we have had to suffer the downstream consequences. I think with AI, we're in a similar crossroads where we have to make some of these decisions. And then I think in 20 years, somebody else will be talking about this on whatever they do in 20 years the same way. And they'll recall to us saying we had all these crossroads that we had to do. Did we rise to the challenges? And I think everybody's approaching the rise to the challenge differently. Take Europe, for instance, right? They have this rule called GDPR, which is a set of standards on data collection, data access, and personal protection that are way more stringent than the United States has. Right. And most people don't realize that the vast majority of AI that's been trained to deploy all around the world has been mostly trained on American data. Mm-hmm. Then we take a step back and say, we're just talking about the biases within our systems and our stuff. But let's say we're going to send some support over to Ukraine, and we want to send some algorithms to do some automation over there to help with some things. Let's just say, I don't know what the use case is, but let's just say, in the same ways that we find biases and a lack of cultural competence in just U.S. data, those same researchers are finding issues in deployment outside of the U.S. because the world view of a lot of this AI is the American view. And that's great if you're in the United States. It's not great when you're talking about a more global sort of thing and you're talking about different deployments and you're talking about getting good information and long-term development, right? If the U.S. has a series of biases, if the life in the United States is very different than life in a lot of the other Western world, and they have innovations, right, then it's harder for us to bring in and automate those innovations on things, and it's harder for us to share some of our innovations with the world in these realms because of that. So we have to get all that kind of figured out too.
Jason, I appreciate you coming on to the podcast and sharing your insights. What's next for Jason? What are you up to?
Our app teams are doing a lot of work in infectious disease right this second. I'm in those realms. I spent a lot of time behind the scenes with COVID. I will be working on long COVID in a couple of areas. I find that to be a challenging frontier. Hopefully, we can develop some artificial intelligence and good machine learning to help more quickly identify people who are struggling with COVID before they get to that long COVID phase so that they can get into the right place. I've been fortunate to work in my career on hard to work with diseases and disorders. I started with autism. There's a lot in autism that's messy. Now we're looking at long COVID. Long COVID is a very messy thing. And I think this is where AI is needed most, is at the cutting edge to help us with the things that we do not understand yet at all. Climate change, COVID, infectious disease, housing, population expansion, all those areas.
Jason, I'd love the opportunity to bring you back on as you delve into these critical areas to further the conversation. I definitely would appreciate that.
That would be great. Happy to come back.